Hello and welcome to episode 18 at the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I will be reading from chapter 4 from the book titled The Internet and Radical Voices of Dissent that I published in 2025. And this chapter is titled Kurdish Woman's Revolution, an interview with Ilham Ahmed, and it's written by Danielle Chapuis. People in the West hear little about the Kurdish struggle for a homeland, particularly from mainstream media outlets. The Kurds haven't been erased from history, although the Turks have tried, but their story in the West is certainly on the margins of knowledge and understanding. Westerners may have heard of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, an organisation which the US, UK, EU and Turkey have prescribed as a terrorist organisation. But this is an empty accusation and meaningless in a world where states cherry-pick who they believe to be terrorists. And then there are the grotesque contradictions. For example, why are the PKK prescribed by the US, whilst the Kurdish YPG, People's Protection Unit, and YPJ, Women's Protection Unit in Syria aren't prescribed, despite their shared ideology with the PKK? The short answer is that the PKK operate in Turkey, and the Turks are a NATO ally of the US, and in turn the US acknowledges a description of the PKK by the Turks, purely because it operates on Turkish soil, orchestrated, by the way, from PKK bases in Kurdistan, northern Iraq. The Americans' interest in Syria, however, diverged from the Turks despite their alliance. Kurdish fighters fought heroically against and defeated ISIS, and today in northeastern Syria, ISIS prisoners are held captive in detention camps across the region. There are 12 camps in total, and the largest of these is Al-Hol near Al-Hasaka. According to a May 2024 report by the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the number of inmates at Al-Hol was 43,446, down from 73,782 in 2019. But despite this decrease, ISIS ideology persists amongst detainees. What may appear odd, however, is the fact that the Kurdish forces adhere to libertarian socialism, and the Americans see that type of political philosophy as something quite close to the devil. As an American rap band, Disposable Heroes of Hypocrisy, once sung, hypocrisy is the greatest luxury, raise the double standard. Sometimes one must dance with whoever is on the dance floor. But it's worth noting that the Kurdish forces have leverage over the Americans if the latter stopped backing them, such as issuing threats to release ISIS prisoners, because without US funds the Kurds will not be able to maintain secure imprisonment of their captives. Wherever the Kurds may exist, the fact is this: their story and our understanding of that story largely remains lost, which sounds bizarre in the age of the internet and mass communication. Why do Westerners know less about the Kurds than they do about the Palestinian cause? Why, for example, does Al Jazeera produce a huge amount of time, money, and effort to report on the Palestinians whilst largely neglecting the Kurds? Why do we in Europe support the Palestinian cause and the fight for a two-state solution whilst doing nothing on the same scale to help Kurds secure a homeland? Why do we agitate or complain about the violation of international law. Zionist illegal settlers violate the land of Palestinians, and yet know virtually nothing about the Turkish repression of the Kurdish people. The answer to the Al Jazeera question is because the Palestinians are Arabs. The Kurds aren't, and Al Jazeera is owned by the Arabic country of Qatar. Of course, that doesn't address why the BBC or CNN or other international broadcasters largely ignore the Kurdish question. The answer to that is because in their collective imagination, the Kurdish question has very little news value. And news values are not governed by objectivity and fairness, but rather they are governed by ideology, created at the editorial level and institutionalized within mainstream journalistic practice. So, if the story of the Kurds is marginalized overall, what about the story of Kurdish women? Where does their story measure on the Richter scale of media coverage? And so it is that this chapter is about how women have entered the world of Kurdish politics and the armed struggle to fight for a homeland, to fight for a culture, language, emancipation, equality and liberation from traditional conservative Kurdish beliefs and against the wider economic and political constraints associated with capitalism. Ilham Ahmed was born in 1972 in a small village near Afrin, northwest Syria, about 30 kilometers from the Turkish border. When Ilham was 1 year old, her family relocated to Tabqa, where Ilham's father worked on building the Tabqa Dam. And she tells me, we lived among the working class. When the Tabqa Dam was finished, Ilham's parents returned to their village, but she remained and continued to live and work in Tabqa, which is situated on the southern part of Lake Assad. In 2017, the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, launched an assault against the Islamist fanatics ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, and referred to as the Battle of Tabqa. The Kurds recaptured both Tabqa and the dam that Ilham's father helped to build. Ilham studied in Aleppo, which is a large, diverse city, and at the time it was known as the industrial capital in Syria. Ilham continued living in Aleppo, learning about city life, local traditions, and the dissimilar roles men and women had within the society. Hence, as a young woman, she soon became aware of the inequalities between men and women. Aleppo has suffered terribly in recent times, with Human Rights Watch reporting that between September 19th and October 18th, 2016 alone, 441 innocent civilians were killed by Russian and Syrian forces during their bombing campaign, and many more have died. Ilham tells me that the time she spent in Aleppo was an important learning period that shaped her views, particularly of the disparities between women and men. And so I ask, what were your initial thoughts on the inequalities you experienced? And Ilham said this: I could not accept it. Men were free to come and go as they pleased, while women stayed at home. I can say that from the age of 12 I became politically aware and learned about my ethnic identity. For instance, I learned what it meant being a Kurd, and to speak Kurdish in society where the Arab language and culture was imposed upon us. I remember how my father celebrated the Kurdish National Day of Newroz, and that he was politically active. Newroz is a Kurdish festival held in March each year and in part is seen as a regenerative force of Kurdish culture. After many years of oppression, Kurds used the festival to express their cultural identity, language, and their place on this earth. Newroz is a festival not only of recognition, but also serves as a reminder to the world that despite all the hardships the Kurds have suffered, we are still here. And here's a poem titled Newroz, written by Tawfik Mahmoud Hamza, otherwise known as Peramud. The New Year's Day is today. Newroz is back, an ancient Kurdish festival with joy and verdure. For many years the flower of our hopes were downtrodden. The poppy of spring was the blood of the youth. It was that red colour on the high horizon of Kurds which was carrying the happy tidings of dawn to remote and near nations. It was Newroz which imbued the hearts with such a fire that made the youth receive death with devoted love. Hooray! The sun is shining from the high mountains of homeland. It is the blood of our martyrs which the horizon reflects. It has never happened in the history of any nation to have the breasts of girls as shields against bullets. Nay, it is not worth crying and mourning for the martyrs of homeland. Ilham Ahmed is currently a member of the Democratic Union Party, PYD, at the time of writing, and sits as the co-president of the Executive Council of the Syrian Democratic Council, MSD, based in Rojava, northern Syria. The Executive Council is a committee that discusses and implements policies of the Federal Assembly, and its members belong to a variety of ethnic groups. This is important to understand, because for outsiders unfamiliar with the politics in Rojava, these official offices are deliberately inclusive. For example, the Executive Council contains a member from the Syriac Union Party, SUP, who are Assyrians that speak Neo-Aramaic language and adhere mostly to Syriac Christianity, a branch of Eastern Christianity. SUP, however, is a secular left-wing organization affiliated to the Assyrian Daronoi movement and its ideology, which is revolutionary socialist. SUP are also a part of the movement for a democratic society, which is in a coalition with the PYD and SUP, and also contains the Beth Narain Women's Protection Forces, HSNB, which is an all-female Assyrian military and police organization created by the Syriac Military Council in 2015. HSNB also subscribed towards the Daronoi ideology, and like other sections of SUP, they are leftists. Other non-Kurds within the Executive Council include, but not limited to, the Honour and Rights Convention, who are secular Arabs, and Turkmen, who are ethnic Turks. This is an example of the multi-ethnic democratic character of the Council that is inclusive, regardless of ethnic differences. Ilham explains how she, like many others, are influenced by the political writings of Abdullah Öcalan, known as Apo, who instigated what he called woman's revolution. In his book The Political Thought of Abdullah Öcalan, he dedicates a chapter titled Liberating Life, Woman's Revolution to this issue and begins by saying, "The question of women's freedom has intrigued me throughout my life. And he goes on to discuss patriarchy. But what is striking is that he takes the reader back to the Neolithic period to make his point that men haven't always played a dominant role in society. And Ilham says this: Öcalan's philosophy was that no revolution will succeed without women. Hence, fighting for women's rights and gender equality became an inseparable part of the struggle. The struggle worked on local and national levels, breaking down the long-standing unequal traditions that restricted women, allowing them to join the struggle and lead. Simultaneously, we started fighting the chauvinistic, centralized system of government that was denying our Kurdish identity. It was a complicated process trying to fight a centralized regime that denies your national identity. Some of our comrades were imprisoned and tortured. The fight Ilham alludes to was, in its earliest form, a political struggle which later in Syria included a military struggle with the formation of the Women's Protection Unit, the YPJ, in 2013. The philosophical framework of the overall women's struggle is couched within the political thoughts of Abdullah Öcalan, especially the concepts of genealogy. Some writers, such as Eda Bunyadin, have referred to genealogy as a philosophy, whilst Öcalan actually proposed it as a science of woman. Jin, G-I-N, is the word for woman in Kurdish, and the concept of genealogy encompasses, but is not restricted to, notions of freedom, liberation, equality, and patriarchy in all its forms. Supporters of genealogy criticize Western forms of feminism because they believe Western feminism has been subsumed and ideologically affected by the economic structure, the base of capitalism, which underpins ideology, and therefore frames thinking and consciousness within such systems. Öcalan also argues that ethics and aesthetics are pivotal to genealogy. Ethics because of the enormous responsibilities upon women and because of their connection to life and existence. This naturally fosters, for him, an emotional intelligence, which in turn enables women to aesthetically contemplate and create a more beautiful life than currently exists. A manifestation of the impact of genealogy on women's real lives occurred with the killing of the Kurdish woman Jini Amini, referred to as Jini Masa Amini in Iran. The Kurdish slogan Jihan Azadi, meaning woman, life, freedom, rang out in protest at the death of Jini. In Iran, the slogan is Zan, Zendegi, Azadi. For Öcalan, the real challenge for women is to systematically break free of restraints under modern forms of capitalism and traditional patriarchal systems. He claims that the oppression isn't based on biology, but rather the restraint is ideological. My understanding of his views is that first and foremost, because of women's natural biology, men primarily see women as birth givers, carers, and nurturers, and ironically see women as biologically inferior in terms of the use of violence or their ability to use military violence and political activity, because that contradicts what has become known as motherhood. But there is a more important ideological dimension to this, and that is women's acceptance of this patriarchal viewpoint as a natural phenomenon, rather than a man-made product that sustains men's dominance, power, and control over women. Ornella Moscucci's book The Science of Woman, published in 2008, is extremely informative on this issue. The central tenet of the book is to investigate whether women's destiny is based on their biology and whether women can break free of this condition. It is an extraordinary piece of work which challenges the view that gynecological science has systematically legitimized the so-called natural conditions of women that confines them to the home and family. Like Öcalan, Moscucci forcefully and convincingly argues that the very notion of femininity as described within gynecological science is in fact an act of politics and is therefore a cultural product dictated by male-dominated scientific thinking. The concepts of normalization, legitimization, and rationalization are pertinent to the understanding of how a condition is manufactured but presented as natural, which is exactly how ideology works in convincing us that this is normality. Such normality is then presented as common sense, a so-called natural way of thinking, but the British cultural theorist Stuart Hall rightly argued that common sense is in fact ideological, manufactured by humans, falsely presented as truth. How many times have you heard, "It makes sense," or "It's common sense to think this way"? Achieving common sense is seen as a natural process, and anything opposing this process is therefore seen as unnatural, different, dangerous, dissenting, and possibly radical when used as a derogatory term. Thus, the normalization, legitimization, and rationalization of ideas are ideological constructs, which, in this present context, women must confront, deconstruct, and renew. Öcalan argued that the only way to break free of the grip of what Marx called the dominant ideology was to embrace a libertarian approach, which in his words was a natural mindset that would disarm or dissemble patriarchal thinking. The process and development of what is commonly termed as civilization and its historical precedent is only to be fully grasped as a history of female enslavement, Öcalan claims. However, Öcalan argues that a new civilization is possible, but only if women have freedom and equality is an important element of the democratization process on which democratic modernity, the alternative system of capitalism, is built. Öcalan also argued that sexism is a powerful element of ideology that both allows the male-dominant establishment to exploit women as cheap labour and enforce its violence over women. Öcalan informs us that there is convincing evidence society was matricentric, in that it was centred around women. He also writes that being a housewife is, I quote, the oldest form of slavery. He calls this a process of housewifization. In other words, it is the tradition of female slavery that became institutionalized or normalized. I cannot think of a comparative Western male Marxist writer who has written so passionately and eloquently about female liberation in such detail, or even dare doing so in fear of female feminist retribution. But Apo's contribution is a revelation, not only because of the detail he presents, but also in the context of a woman's revolution within a Kurdish revolution. The issue of female emancipation and women's overall position within Kurdish society is intriguing enough, but perhaps what is more intriguing is that for Ilham and Kurdish women it makes no difference that the political thoughts that inspire them concerning the women's revolution is a man. Becoming politically aware at the tender age of 12 says a lot about the character and spirit of Ilham, and that's what she possessed. This period was not only educational for her, it set the benchmark for her determination to act on what she had experienced. She explains what it was like for a young, independent Kurdish woman to live in a culturally and politically strict conservative society. As a child, she recalls how Arab identity was imposed on the Kurds and that they were banned from speaking Kurdish or even identifying as Kurds. And she says this: "We had to study in Arabic and speak in Arabic. They had no other choice but to discreetly speak in Kurdish or celebrate Newroz indoors, using candles as opposed to dancing around and open fire in public, which for Kurds is the traditional way to celebrate the festival." And Ilham says this: "As Kurds, we were denied our rights. I can say that as a young woman, I was denied my rights to inequalities between men and women. And as a Kurd, I was denied my rights to speak Kurdish, study in Kurdish, or practice Kurdish traditions." At the time, there were several Kurdish political parties, including communists and the PKK, who were originally established on the other side of the border in Turkey. But because they were banned in Turkey, they began operating from Syria. Because of the PKK's stand on women's rights, equality, Kurdish rights and freedom, Ilham identified with them more than with the other groups. At the time, the PKK leader Abdullah Öcalan was in Syria, and she tells me that local Kurds and Arab tribal leaders welcomed him alike. What I find fascinating here is that Ilham rejected the communists, preferring the PKK, who after all are both influenced by Marx. However, it is telling that the PKK's position towards female liberation within the movement and within wider society was, and remains, far more advanced and progressive than any other leftist grouping out there. I want to pursue the position of Kurdish women a little further, so I ask Ilham how difficult it was to confront traditions and the expectations that Kurdish women were expected to follow. And she says this: "The cultural traditions that were imposed are extraordinarily complex. The difference between Kurdish women, Arab women, and even Assyrians are visible, especially on the provincial ground. In Rojava, there is even a difference between Kobani and Jazira concerning the social structure." To understand this in more detail, I will explain the geographical areas that Ilham is referring to. Rojava, an administrative area in North Syria close to the Turkish border, is made up of 3 regions or 3 cantons, which are Afrin, Kobani, and Jazira. Afrin is in the western part of Rojava, Kobani is central, and Jazira is in the east. In Afrin there was a family system in place, not governed by tribalism, and within the family system there were, as Ilham puts it, windows of freedom. In other words, there was a civil society that counteracted and kept tribalism at bay. There was, for example, a women-led grassroots organization where women did not primarily rely on men to subsist and pursue their own pathways. She compares this societal structure with tribal areas, telling me that women there weren't in control of their own bodies and thoughts, adding that to break these chains they need education and determination. Kurdish women, she says, can lead the way and help others attain their rights. I'm keen to discover the main reasons that Ilham had to be involved in politics and to explore what obstacles as a woman she had to overcome to get her voice heard. She tells me there were 2 reasons for getting involved in politics. The first was to contest the male-dominated political sphere that had introduced bans and restrictions on women. And because men design the political system for men, this requires active women involvement to change and challenge this system of thinking. The second reason she took up political activity was due to the discrimination between Kurds and Arabs, and the fact that Kurdish identity and rights were denied. And Ilham says this: "When I decided to enter politics, I wanted the Kurds to be free to exercise their rights. It was a life decision for me. It was a new life. As a woman, I encountered many obstacles in the beginning. The social activities were difficult. The social stigma and restrictions was apparent, from travelling alone, campaigning, to speaking at public events, especially the social stigma that it was shameful, dishonourable for women to break these traditions and barriers." I wanted to delve a little deeper about Ilham's personal journey of political discovery, so I asked her how old she was when she joined the movement and where she started from. And Ilham says this: "I was 14, and with a group of like-minded friends we started rebelling against the restrictive measures put in place by the then regime by openly speaking Kurdish language in public. In 1984 and 1985, the Newroz celebration was banned. So we organised music, poetry and dance groups to publicly celebrate Newroz, rebelling against the government ban. Kurds were speaking Kurdish at home. It was difficult not to speak Kurdish in public because some did not know how to speak Arabic or had a distinctive accent when speaking Arabic in public or at workplaces. Either way, we would be immediately identified as Kurdish. It was degrading and demoralizing. At every opportunity, Ilham and her friends were breaking down taboo barriers, and consequently they were met with hostility and negative reactions. When she decided to get involved in politics, there were big disagreements within her family. Not that her family did not want freedom and fairness, but like many Kurdish parents, they could not bear seeing their child taking risks and getting involved in politics when it was banned in Syria. And the family knew that the risks included arrest, imprisonment, torture, kidnapping, and even assassination. It was difficult for her to refuse her parents' objections, especially given the strong bond they had as a tight-knit family group. But she had already made up her mind that she would join the struggle. And she says this: "The PKK's ideology and Öcalan's philosophy resonated with me, especially the fact that they worked towards achieving women's rights, human rights, and national rights. When I was 17 years old, it was rare for a girl to go to the market without a male guardian. Breaking that tradition was taboo. Every time we were breaking these cultural restrictions, we were encountering great difficulties from the community." In March 2022, Ilham gave a speech in Afrin, telling the crowd, "Your resistance in Shaba is evidence of our attachment to our land." So I ask, what do you mean by attachment to our land? And Ilham says this: "Afrin is my city. It is a place of my dreams and imaginations. Our family heritage is there. Neighbours, friends, all there. I have a strong connection with Afrin. The connection with Afrin and its trees is like a connection with one's children. It takes a lot of time and effort to grow trees, and seeing them being cut down by the invading forces is painful to the people of Afrin. Even though people of Afrin have been denied passports by the regime, they never considered emigrating. Now they are driven out of the city, they remain close to it as a source of comfort, to breathe Afrin air. Knowing this about the people of Afrin guided my Neuros speech on Shaba resistance and people's resilience. An important objective for the Kurds is the creation of a polyethnic society, which strikes me as one of the most radical objectives associated with the Kurdish struggle. So I ask Ilham how realistic it is to build a polyethnic society, considering the diverse cultures and ethnic groups that exist throughout Syria and the differences therein. And she says this: within the Syrian society there are Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkoman, Druze, Yazidi, Christian, Alevi, Sunni, and Armenians. What the regime has done is to try and eradicate their identities by imposing Arab identity and Sunni as the official national religion. She tells me that cultural differences and traditions between groups must be preserved and protected by a new constitution. All should have access to education in their own languages, and it is only then that they can feel to be an equal part of Syria. Through a new constitution, she says, Syria can become a progressive, democratic country where human rights are respected. I turn our conversation towards the internet and the role social media plays within Kurdish struggle. So I ask whether it provides a space for women to speak freely without male interference. Ilham begins by telling me that the role of social media is extremely important for our struggle, and that before social media was available, activists had to go house to house to try and communicate with potential supporters to bring attention to issues. And Ilham says this: it was even more difficult to do this when trying to break down social barriers on women's rights, equalities, and to try to convince them that the situation was not normal and that it needed to be changed. The technological advancement and emergence of social media have contributed significantly to the struggle. Women can organize themselves, exchange thoughts, and communicate with each other through these digital platforms with ease. In other words, social media has significantly increased the opportunities. The use of the internet can be viewed on the YPJ's website, which produces an all-female analysis of events in Syria, as well as updates on the Kurdish struggle overall. For example, under the headline, "To Our People and Public Opinion," they offer their assessment of the overthrow of the Assad regime in December 2024 by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And this is what they say: certain jihadist groups affiliated with the Turkish occupation and entities like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, orchestrated and supported by international powers, entered Damascus unchallenged. The apparent victory of the jihadists as they advance towards Damascus is likely to be short-lived. The new Syria that emerges from this ideology risks becoming another Afghanistan. And they continue to say this: the Turkish state bears primary responsibility for the 13-year-old conflict endured by the Syrian people. Over this period, Turkish state and its mercenaries have repeatedly attacked the regions of north and eastern Syria. The current attack on these regions, which were established on the principles of women's freedom, is being carried out by ISIS-linked groups under the guise of the so-called National Army. Led by the Women's Protection Units, YPJ, our forces liberated these areas from the scourge of ISIS, transforming the region into an oasis of hope and stability where diverse ethnic and ideological communities coexist peacefully. However, our region remains a target for Turkish occupation and its mercenaries. These territories, defended under the leadership of the Women's Protection Units, the Women's Army and the Syrian Democratic Forces, now face renewed threats from ISIS and the Republic of Turkey. The YPJ website also provides a list of the women who have been killed by the fascist Turkish occupation, as YPJ says. The official YouTube channel can be located at YPJ Media Center, and they also have a Facebook page located at facebook.com/YPJ Defense Unit. And anyone that wishes to contact the YPJ can do so by sending the group an email to the following address: YPJ_womensdefend@protonmail.com. This is simply an example of how the YPJ, like many other dissenting armed guerrilla groups, are currently using new media technology to advance their cause. The YPJ Media Center have a small number of videos, some demonstrating the assassinations of their female comrades, such as Zainab Walat, real name Zainab Mohammed, and Arjin Rashid Merwan, real name Barfin Mohammed. The YPJ said that Zainab Walat was, and I quote, guided by the philosophy of leader Abdullah Öcalan, and that Comrade Arjin Marwan built her revolutionary journey in the footsteps of her uncle, the martyr Walat Afrin, who fought against occupation during the 1990s and was martyred there. Another guerrilla fighter killed in this conflict as a result of the attacks by the fascist Turkish occupation, as the YPJ says, is Heavy Umud, real name Sadia Ahmed. And the YPJ go on to say this: as the Women's Protection Units, YPJ, we have confronted these attacks with great faith and determination since our establishment. From now on, we will stand as a steel shield against all forms of genocide and occupation. The YPJ use video online to commemorate their martyred as a memorial for their suffering and cause. The videos are moving testaments to those women who have fallen in battle. I ask Ilham why Westerners know a lot more about the Palestinian struggle than the Kurdish struggle. Ilham explains that the Palestinian struggle is old and has many Arab states supporting it, and that they helped bring attention to this struggle. And she tells me this: we Kurds are alone. Our only loyal friends are our mountains. Adding that whenever the Kurds were repressed and targeted by one of the Turkish, Iranian, Iraqi or Syrian regimes, many Arab regimes supported Kurdish suppression. There was news coverage when the Kurds were fighting against ISIS, but this was only because of the connection between ISIS and its threat to Western countries, and not because ISIS were a threat to the Kurds. Ilham explains this in more detail. The Kurdish struggle became known internationally, particularly after the fight against ISIS, even though there have been continued struggles before the emergence of ISIS, including the Mahabat Revolution in eastern Kurdistan, Iran, Barzani Revolution in southern Kurdistan, Iraq, and the PKK struggle throughout Kurdistan, Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. Also, Kurds in the diaspora have contributed towards the struggle. The YPJ also produce an online magazine called YPJ Star on their website. In the November 2024 edition, they produced a report titled A Mass March of Men for the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. The men-only march included citizens from Raqqa and Tabqa, along with representatives of the autonomous democratic administration, civil and military councils and communities, the Future Syria Party, and tribal elders and dignitaries of the region. The men were shouting, "Jinn, Jihan, Azadi, woman, life, freedom," as they marched. I cannot think anything comparable to this march anywhere. It is truly exceptional and inspirational to women and men. Despite the American support of the SDF against the wishes of Turkey, the former often shows high levels of treachery and hypocrisy towards Kurdish fighters. An example of this hypocrisy is demonstrated by the assassination of Commander Jihan Tolidan and her two comrades, Commanders Rojava and Barin Butan, on July 22, 2022. The Turkish military flew through US-controlled airspace, presumably with the latter's permission, and blew up the car all three were travelling in. I had subsequently watched a documentary on YouTube called Jihan, Story of a Female Guerrilla Fighter, made by Haluk Unal, and was greatly moved by this courageous woman who had fought against ISIS. I asked Ilham if she can tell me anything about Jihan and her thoughts about her death. First, Ilham tells me that Jihan was also from Afrin, a young woman whose role in fighting ISIS was pivotal until a Turkish drone struck her car on her way to a social event in Kamishlo. And Ilham says this: the Turkish government targets these influential female individuals to kill their ideas. The truth is, ideas and progress do not die with these individuals. Whether the Turkish government like it or not, these ideas spread. They develop and pass through country borders and prison walls. By killing Jihan Tolidan, our struggle became even stronger and more determined to achieve our objectives. On the contrary, Turkey's tactics remain ineffective and in no way deter us from fighting for our rights. The documentary explains how Jihan was subjected to the same kind of racism and inequality that Ilham did from the Syrian Arab educational system. Jihan also rebelled against the forced separation of boys and girls in her village and steadfastly refused to be married against her will. The video also describes how Jihan ran away from her family and eventually joins the YPJ. From her personal experience, Jihan knew how Christian and Muslim women had a shared experience of patriarchal oppression, and she understood how women's oppression is imposed in all political systems in the Middle East. In 2011, during the Arab Spring, Jihan helped to organize a peaceful uprising against the Syrian regime, while simultaneously agitating amongst women to inspire them to seek liberation and freedom. Abdullah Öcalan's statement, "All slavery is based on housewifization," is fitting to highlight in the context of Cihan's actions and resistance to the conservative patriarchal society that she, Ilham, and women in the region grew up in. Men may defend such conservatism as both natural and as a normal way of life, and defend it because they believe it's a tradition. But all traditions are invented. There is nothing natural about man-made traditions, and by dissenting, the women in Rojava, region, and beyond are confronting what is an unequal relationship of power, and as Apo says, power is synonymous with masculinity. But he also states that this power is a form of enslavement for men, restricting their capacity to think more broadly and strategically about a new gender relationship between women and men. Öcalan's statement that the woman's revolution is a revolution within a revolution demonstrates the many battles and fronts that women must fight against. The fight against male conservatism in their own communities, the fight towards a Kurdish homeland, and a fight against a capitalist system that is based on class and wealth inequalities. Ilham's comments regarding the use of the internet and social media by women for women is an act of dissent and resistance against the many fronts that women are engaged in, and such new technology has altered the means and acts of resistance in both the political and military spheres, which have undoubtedly changed the way that both politicians and female guerrilla fighters confront their enemies to help achieve the kind of society they wish to gain for both women and men. So, who am I in this story of resistance? I am Danielle Chapuis, of French heritage and currently living and working in Armenia. It is widely recognized that the Armenians suffered genocide by the Ottomans between 1915 and 1923, and so I can connect with what is happening today against the Kurds. My activism is more inspired today after learning about the Kurdish women who are fighting for a homeland and to preserve their culture and language. I can relate to this because I am from Brittany, in France, where the Breton culture and language has been under threat for years. In the next episode, I'll be discussing the chapter on the Iranian political exile Roshi Rusabahani. So for now, goodbye.